Let us welcome Nick Wagner.
All right. Thanks very much. Let's see if this is loud enough. If I'm not loud enough, just raise your hand and I'll try to amp it up a little bit. And when Steve was asking who's uncomfortable being on video, I didn't know if I was allowed to raise my hand or not. I also want to ask one more who's here question. How many people here actually went through the RCIA process yourself? Wow, that's great. Wonderful, wonderful. On my schedule, it said that we're going to go to 11:15, so I'm going to be a little longer than an hour, so don't get anxious. But 11:15, we'll stop, we'll take a break, and as Steve said, we'll come back. And if you have any questions, you can ask them then. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, I'm kind of informal, so just shout it out or raise your hand or whatever you're comfortable with. If you're an introvert, write down your question as you think of it, and then when we come back for after the break, then you can ask it then, all right? So this is our outline for today. We're going to talk about our past, where we've been with the RCIA, and then the present, what is the normative vision of the rite of Christian initiation of adults, and then the future, based on a lot of the stuff that Pope Francis is challenging us to. So that's where we're going to go. And at the very end of this, I'm going to give you a website you can go to download all the slides. So if you don't want to take notes like crazy, then you can get the slides at the end. All right. When a little while ago, Father Gabe asked me how I got started in all this. And I was a mere child. I started after my first communion. And I started just after college. I got a job at a campus ministry center in St. Louis. St. Louis is my hometown. And the priest who ran the campus ministry center, the reason he picked that spot in the Archdiocese of St. Louis is because that outpost was about the furthest away that you could get from the Chancery office downtown. And so he didn't like going downtown and dealing with all the Chancery bureaucracy and stuff. And we got, just after I started working there, we got a fax. You remember those? The fax? Yeah. We got a fax, and it said that every parish, every chaplaincy, every sort of Catholic group was supposed to send somebody downtown to hear about this new thing. So the other thing my boss didn't like besides Chancery bureaucracy was new things. So he sent me down to learn this. And it was in a room not as nice as this one. It had that Catholic school green paint on the walls, and it was kind of cinder blocks, and it was packed though because folks were curious they'd heard about this thing called the RCIA. They didn't quite know what that was. Some of us thought it was the Roman Catholic Intelligence Agency, and the priest who was leading us through this explanation of what it was, he didn't really know either. He'd been to some workshop for diocesan folks somewhere else, and he came back with a bunch of those overhead slides or overhead transparencies. All the young people are saying, what are overhead transparencies? And he was showing them up here, and they were upside down and backwards, how that. And I was getting ready to kind of sneak out because I was bored, which I know some of you are about there right now, but hang on. He then got to the point where he talked about the dismissal of the catechumens. Now, for those of you that stood up a while ago, and like folks have been doing this 20 years or more, do you remember when you first heard about that, the dismissal of the catechumens? For me, this would be 1981, I think, 82, somewhere in there. And St. Louis, if you know St. Louis is a very, very Catholic town. Kind of a little conservative, solid Midwestern bedrock Catholics. And a priest of the Archdiocese is standing up in front of us all and saying, we're gonna ask people to leave in the middle of Mass before the collection. And that lit me up. I started to think about what that would mean. If a group of people would sort of stand up for their faith in the middle of Mass, and all the, sort of regular Catholics, those of us who grew up Catholic in that parish, looking at these people standing up, what's their reaction going to be? Who are those people? What are they doing? Why is Father sending them out of Mass? And I learned later that's what we call a teachable moment. When people's curiosity is raised, when they have questions, then we can start to kind of fill in that gap, start to talk about why this is important. And I kind of got it all in a flash all of a sudden, that if we could really do that in the Archdiocese, in every parish in the Archdiocese, and we could get parishioners all across St. Louis to start asking about their faith, asking why these folks are doing what they're doing, why they're going through such work to become Catholics. Well, wouldn't that cause the people in our parishes to ask themselves, well, why am I Catholic? Why is it important to me? Why do I come here every Sunday? And you know, that's what drives me. I think the conversion of the catechumens is important. I think the catechesis that we provide for Protestants who are becoming Catholic is important. But I think the real joy for me, the real power of this rite is it's not just about them. It's about the whole parish community. And not just my parish, but the whole diocese or archdiocese. And not just my diocese, but the whole Catholic community across the world. We begin to start to really name our faith and talk about our faith in a way that makes a difference. So as we're talking about RCIA, I think it's important to start with not so much what we're doing or how we're doing it or are we doing it right, but really talk about why we're doing it. Do you remember when you first heard about this rite? Why? There are a few people here who grew up, you know, they're young enough that they've always had this, huh? But for those of us who have a little gray in our hair, you remember when you first heard about this? And how did you start to make it such an important factor in your life, such an important ministry? Pope Francis, shortly after he became Pope, issued that document, Joy of the Gospel. And he said in there, I dream of a missionary option. And that's what I thought about RCIA. I wasn't as poetic as Pope Francis. I didn't use that phrase. But I thought about this. This will be like, you know, folks really taking their faith seriously. A missionary option. That is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times, schedules, languages, and structures. You can tell he was archbishop in a place where he really got into the parishes, right? Because he's labeled your job description there. Where all of that stuff, all the stuff we do in our parishes, everything that's in your Sunday bulletin, everything that's on your parish calendar, all the stuff that your bishop is out doing today because he's so busy, that all of that stuff will be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. To inspire in pastoral workers, you and me, to inspire in us a constant desire to go forth and in this way to elicit a positive response from everyone whom Jesus summons to friendship with himself. I think when folks are new on RCIA teams or when folks come to us and they say they want to become Catholic, I think we too quickly default into, well, here's the stuff you have to do to become Catholic. And at least today, I want us to suspend that a little bit and try to get into the thinking of what Pope Francis is challenging us to here. That what this is all about is a friendship with Jesus. That we're trying to bring people into, Pope John Paul II said, we're trying to bring people into communion and intimacy with the person of Jesus Christ. That's what it's all about. And everything else is just kind of details. We have to kind of have the why we're doing this in front of us before we talk about the what and the how. Some of you, tell me about your experience when you first heard about the RCIA. How did you get the why? How did that happen for you? When did you first hear about it? Yeah.
I was a newly ordained priest.
Yeah.
And there was a workshop being done in the Camden Diocese, right across from where my parish was. I was stationed in the lower part of Trenton Diocese. And I went, and although we did have some inkling in the seminary, it wasn't as broken open as much as it was done. It was sponsored by the board. And the whole concept of formation and information kind of being brought together and making it experiential as well as learning was something new.
Cool. Okay. Yes.
I was working in a parish in the Allentown, Pennsylvania diocese, and a local seminary, Vincentian Seminary, had an intermester sponsored by the Paulist Evangelization Society, 1980, 81, who held an intermester 2-week course for seminarians and others who would like to come. And it became apparent to me that this was going to have to be pretty important for these young priests to know about and to be ready to deal with it.
Yeah.
As well as those of us who were working in parishes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Someone else? Yes.
I had someone one time approached me and they said, I need to look at my life differently, so I think I need to become Catholic because you seem to always know where you're going.
Yeah.
So that was for her that I was like, okay, and I never thought about how to become Catholic because I was born into it.
Yeah.
Like, so that was my introduction to someone else who's wanting to find a new way in the world.
That's great. Wonderful. How about you? Yeah.
We had a parish visit us, St. Peter's at the time, to explain to us what RCIA was all about. And they called a group of us together. And I sort of like fell in love with it the first I heard about it.
Yeah.
But my problem is I was so active in other church ministries, I knew that this took full time. It just took all of your strength.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it at that time, knowing though that that was the desire of my heart to do RCIA.
Yeah.
And you know, the Lord, He just kind of rearranged things in my life.
Yeah.
And it took 10 years, but I came on staff. It wasn't just, volunteer, but I came on staff at RCIA. So it was just a beautiful story for me.
Okay. All right. We'll do one more, and then go ahead.
I did it in reverse. I was having difficulties with our church, and I went through the RCIA program for becoming a Protestant. And the minister at that point said, Margie, what are you? And I said, I'm Catholic. I'll always be Catholic. I believe in that. No offense to our clergy here, but he said, you Catholics do it all the time. You let those priests laud things over you. Keep your faith if that's where it's strong. And that reinforced my faith to become active in my faith and share my faith with those around me.
Wonderful. That's great. So I know we all got lots of stories, so share them at lunch, share them with each other, but I want to move on here to make sure we get you out on time. This is the, when I first heard about the RCIA at that meeting in St. Louis, I thought it was something that, the United States bishops or somebody, some theologian somewhere had invented. And it took me a while before I really got to understand the history of it. And of course, it dates back to Jesus' mandate to go and make disciples, which is recorded for us in Matthew's Gospel. And so then, after the resurrection, the New Testament community is sort of adrift. That's sort of the beginning of Acts. They're a little bit lost until the Holy Spirit comes and inflames their hearts, and then they start trying to figure it out. How are we going to fulfill the mandate? Go and make disciples. So the stories we have throughout the New Testament, we heard one of them in the prayer service. The stories throughout the New Testament have these different methodologies, different ways of instituting the initiation of new folks into this New Testament, this Christian community. But throughout that period, the practice was varied. It was, you know this just from reading the Acts of the Apostles. The practices were different in different places. People got sort of the sacraments out of order. It's like they hadn't heard of Thomas Aquinas yet, so he hadn't lined it all up systematically for them. So we can't really look to the New Testament for the origins of what we have today as the catechumenate. That happens a little bit later. It starts to develop in the 3rd century. It begins to take shape. So still pretty early. But you can see in some of the documents from the early 200s the actual structure that looks real similar to what we have today. And then the next centuries were what's called the golden age of the catechumenate. That's where it really solidified, and that was pretty standard throughout most of the churches in the world, most of the Christian churches in the world, that this is the way that you go on this journey of faith, the way that you're drawn into friendship with Christ. In 315, if you remember your history books, that's when the Roman emperor converted to Christianity, and so then lots and lots of people want to become Christian. And that caused a strain on the resources of a parish. So just imagine that you get next week, you get 100, 200, 500 people that want to become Catholic. Oh, that would happen, you know. Well, we all wish for that, but think about it practically. What would happen? What would have to change in your parish to accommodate that, you know? And so that was kind of what was going on in the 4th century after the emperor became Christian, is so many people want to become Catholic, it starts to put a strain on things. Toward the end of the 5th century, the practice of the church began to focus on infant baptism. Why is that? Yeah, the theology of the teaching about original sin sort of got crystallized throughout this century, and then toward the end of the century, in order to keep babies from going to hell or limbo, depending on what century you grew up in, there's a shift now to infant baptism. So by the time we get to the 1100s, catechumen has pretty much completely died out, except in religious orders. So that a lot of you are familiar with this, that to become, in most religious orders, there's a staged process, and you go through various rites, and you get different names as you go along throughout the process, and different names are different in each order. But the religious orders sort of kept a vestige of the catechumenate process. Toward the 1500s, then we have a period of just mass baptisms, where missionaries would go into villages and just baptize everybody, you know, or a king or a duke or some landowner would convert to Christianity, and so all his workers and slaves and serfs, and they would all have to become Christian. But there was no formation attached to that. It was just, basically the act of baptism. And then the missionaries in Africa, a group who were called the White Fathers, Society of Missionaries for Africa, I think is the official name. But they wore white habits, so they were called the White Fathers. And they got really dissatisfied with this, sort of going to the village and baptize everybody, because they saw that nobody was really living the faith. Nobody was really practicing the disciplines and values of Catholicism. And so they looked to the catechumenal model, and they began to experiment with elements of the catechumenate in the villages where they were ministering. That went on up until the 20th century. And by the 20th century, mid-20th century or so, places in Europe, especially France, were beginning to be thought of as post-Christian countries, meaning, they're nominally Christian, and maybe some people are even baptized, but as a country, they're not really living Christian values anymore. And so a woman named Paulette Guzzi began to experiment with the catechumenate in Paris. And so there were some beginnings of a restored catechumenate in France before the Second Vatican Council. At Vatican II, all of these experiments and learnings came to a head, kind of, and there were experts at the Second Vatican Council who were talking to the bishops on their coffee breaks and at dinner and the after parties, and they would talk to the bishops about this, and the bishops began to really take seriously this idea of the catechumenate. You remember the whole reason that Pope John called for the Second Vatican Council was to help the church, kind of have a new breath, a new vision, a restored presence in the world that was meaningful. And they began to see the catechumenate as a way to do this. So in 1963, the bishops, in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, which was the first document published by the Council, the bishops called for a restoration of the catechumenate. Just after the council, a study group was formed that was chaired by Balthasar Fischer, and they completed a a text that began to be used experimentally in some churches around Europe and the United States. Pope Paul VI approved the final version of that in 1972. So the official Latin text of the RCIA was approved in 1972. There was a provisional translation of that in 1974. So you know how this works with Roman documents. They're written, it was, Balthasar Fisher was German, so it was probably originally written in German, and then it was translated into Latin, and then back into German and English and Spanish and so on. So the official text is Latin. It's translated in all these languages. Because there was so much translation activity going on at this time, remember all the sacraments were reformed, so there's a lot of translation going on. So the translation of the RCIA was done very quickly. So it was always called a provisional translation. And some of you, when you started, you were using what some people call the Orange Book. Is that what it was called? It was a little bit before my time. Anybody remember? Yeah, what was that?
I don't know if I remember it, but I do remember it because at the Eucharistic Congress in 1978 in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
Cardinal Dulles spoke about this because he was a convert himself. And it was a meeting where Mother Teresa and Dorothy Day and all of them were there.
Oh my gosh. Can I touch you? You're like a second-class relic. Wow.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. So in that time, in that era, the text we were using was the translation itself. Everybody knew that was not going to be the final translation. It was just so we could get going on it. And so I think it actually said on the cover, provisional translation. A lot of people took that to mean that the rite itself was provisional. So if you were head of a large parish and you were busy and you had a lot of things to do, and like my boss at the campus center, you didn't want one more new thing. And so you see that word provisional and you put that on the shelf. And so then when the official translation, before I get to the translation we have now, I want to talk about what happened in 1981. A lot of you have heard of Christiane Brusselmans and Jim Dunning. Christiane was doing a lot of work in Europe for a decade before this. In 1981, she partnered up with Jim Dunning, who is a priest of the Seattle Archdiocese, and they had a meeting in Estes Park, Colorado, with 200 of their best friends. And out of that meeting, they established the North American Forum on the Catechumenate. How many have heard of that? Okay. So for those of you not raising your hand, the North American Forum on the Catechumenate is probably the organization, the reason that the RCIA is so well established in the United States and Canada. They were a group of mostly volunteers, mostly lay people, who committed themselves to establishing the process of the RCIA in every parish in North America. And they existed from 1981 until 2013. They kind of went out of business. They had some financial trouble and they had to close their doors. But how many of you have been to a forum event? Yeah. You can tell stories at lunch to those that haven't been. They were powerful retreat-like experiences, but full of information. And for a lot of us, really gave us the vision in living color, kind of a live event vision of what the RCIA was supposed to be. In 1986, then, the U.S. bishops approved the current translation. So if some of you have your RCIA books on your table, that was approved in 1986 by the U.S. bishops. And then because the provisional translation had been taken to mean the rite was provisional, the bishops were very clear that by September 1, 1988, this was the only way to initiate people into the church through the rite of Christian initiation of adults. So that's the anniversary that we're celebrating, the mandate of the rite in 1988. By the turn of the century, it's estimated more than 80% of U.S. parishes were using the rite. 2007 is when we formed Team RCIA. So the forum was still around in 2007, but they didn't have a lot of online presence. And so if you can remember all the way back to when we didn't have easy access to the internet, so that started to change in the early 2000s. So my wife and I thought, well, we were on the forum team and we would go out and do events and folks would get really excited and turned on about the right, but then they go home and they want more support. They'd have a question or they'd get stuck or they couldn't figure something out. And the forum really wasn't set up to help people after they got back home. So we started an online ministry, Team RCIA, to help support that. And then when the forum went out of business, folks started calling us to do live events, and we've been doing that now since the forum left us. So today then, what's going on today is an average of 67,000 adults, did I get that right, are baptized, and 83,000 are received into full communion in the United States on average every year. Yeah. Isn't that astounding? Yeah. Okay, so that was a really quick rush through the timeline. I want to go back and mention a couple things. So back here to this this New Testament era, as the early church is trying to figure it out. Okay, so they did not use the phrase missionary option that Pope Francis is using, but that's what they were doing. You remember this passage from Acts, right? I'm going to read this kind of fast, but what I'd like you to do is, as I'm reading it, just focus in on one phrase or one thing that this New Testament community was doing. So these are, we always think of the 12 apostles and we think they were running everything, but this is all of the Christians of Jerusalem and Galilee in that era. They're all kind of doing this, and Luke is telling this story. Luke himself probably came through something like a catechumenate process or something like what they were doing in the New Testament community, because he didn't know the historical Jesus. So he was evangelized into the faith after the resurrection. And he's telling this story about what happened to the first community of disciples, which again, he was not really part of. He's kind of telling the story about what happened to them. So imagine you're part of that group. You're part of that first community. And what's your job in this, of all the things they're doing here? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of the bread and the prayers, and awe came upon everyone, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together, all had all things in common, and they would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So what did you hear in there? Name one thing that the early community was doing.
They broke the bread.
They broke bread. What else?
Fellowship.
Fellowship. Teaching. Time together. Acts of charity.
Distributing proceeds.
Hanging out. Yeah. Distributing what they had. Yep.
Many wonders and signs.
Wonders and signs. Yeah. Yes. They were glad, yeah. But you hear Pope Francis all the time, no sourpusses. That is an official document, which again has to be in Latin first. And I want to know what the Latin word for sourpusses is. Do we have any? No. Yes.
All came upon everyone, so it's inside the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, filled with the Spirit. Yeah. What else? See, so this is the roots of the RCIA. When the bishops said we got to go back and restore the catechumenate, this is what they're looking for. They're looking for a community that's going to do this stuff. So you can break this down into the disciplines of faith that we apprentice the catechumens into. And so these are all the things they did for the purpose of conversion, to bring people into that friend. This is the why, right? To bring people into that friendship with Jesus. Sometimes I think because the RCIA is kind of a complicated rite, and there's so many publishers, God bless them, they put out these resources for us, but you could fill a wall with all the stuff we're supposed to teach people when they show up and they say they want to be Catholic. And this is what the first apostles did, and day by day the Lord added to those who were being saved. Really, if you believe in Scripture what we teach the catechumens, that it is true, that it is God's Word, if we do this stuff day by day, God is going to add to our numbers. 67,000 baptized last year. Okay. So, a lot of people who are sort of, I don't know why, there's people who kind of don't like the RCIA, and I don't know why. I don't know why, but they'll put out fake news about it. And they'll say the RCIA doesn't work. And I just saw this last week on some other website. Somebody said that 50% of people who go through the RCIA drop out after their baptism or after Easter. And I looked through the article online. I looked for the source that they're citing. There's no source. You'll see, I saw, like 2 years ago, I saw one that said 70% of the people drop out. No source. I don't know where, it just sort of gets repeated on the internet. If it's on the internet, it must be true, right?
Right, of course.
It's not true. There's a group, a real research group called Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA. Anybody heard of that, CARA? They're a really, really wonderful group of researchers, sociologists, statisticians, and they estimate that, they estimate conservatively that folks who go through a catechumenate process, that there's an 84% retention rate. Now name one other faith formation process in your diocese that has an 84% retention rate. It matters, however, what we mean by RCIA when we say we are doing the RCIA in our parish. It matters what really is happening. Another sociologist named David Yemeni did some research a few years ago, and he saw that if, to the extent that a parish is really doing what is the normative vision that's in the RCIA text, to the extent they're following the vision that's in there, those parishes are more successful at retaining folks who go through the process, having them become active in their communities, and living out the disciplines of the faith. If you're less attentive to what the normative vision of the rite is, you have less success with getting folks deeply involved in Catholic life. Does that make sense? Okay, so it matters if we're following the vision then of what's in the RCIA. So what's the vision? In paragraphs 4 and 5 of the RCIA, it lists these 6 principles. And we're going to go through these a little more in depth, but I just want to show them to you here. That's the core of the vision, that we follow these 6 principles. Those 6 principles lead to a catechetical apprenticeship process in which the seekers learn to live as Christians in these 4 areas of faith. These are the 4 disciplines of faith that are structured in the RCIA process. Okay? And we're going to go into those more deeply too. Then we have the principles, we have the formation for the seekers, and all of that is a sacramental process. So this is not RCIA is not fundamentally about catechesis. I wish I could get everybody to stop using the initials. I tried that for years and I can't. But let's just forget the initials. What is the book that we're using? What is the rite that we're using? What's it called? Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults. It's a rite of initiation, a sacrament. So this is the ritual process. This whole thing can be considered the sacrament of initiation. And it's a ritual sacramental process that our seekers go through. So we have to remember that's the normative vision. So when somebody comes to us and says they want to be Catholic, a lot of times they might say it like, what do I have to know to become Catholic? Or how soon can I become Catholic?
Yes, that's the good
Or when are Catholic classes? You know? And so that's not the vision. It's not about school. The vision is it's a sacramental journey of faith and why do we do this? So that we'll be drawn into that friendship, that intimacy with Jesus. Okay. Aidan Kavanaugh was a liturgical theologian that I read a lot when I was starting out. He said, what the Roman documents contain, particularly the RCIA, what the Roman documents contain are not merely specific changes in liturgical rubrics, but a restored, unified vision of the church. One might describe it as a concentric ecclesiology locked together by the sacramental discipline of faith shared on all levels. I never met Aidan Kavanaugh, but he was from Texas. He wound up being a professor at Yale Divinity School. And so he learned to talk like this, I think, at Yale. But in Texas, he would say things like, that dog won't hunt or stuff like that. So if you ever got him to, people tell me, if you ever got him to talk about this in real language, he would say stuff more like, what this does, it just returns us to that why that we learn from the community and Acts of the Apostles. The restoration of the right changes us back to that vision of the church. Okay? So it's not about preserving the institution of the Catholic Church. It's about converting people day by day, bringing people into that friendship with Jesus. The restoration of the rights is meant to do that for us. I'm going to tell you about my diocese a little bit. My wife was the director of worship for our diocese for about 15 years. And RCIA was one of the things under her umbrella. And I always chide her a little bit. I say, we have this sort of international presence where we talk about RCIA a lot and tell people like best practices and things, and nobody in our diocese does it. Who's in charge around here? That didn't earn me brownie points. But she did, we together, we did a lot to try to help, and some parishes are doing pretty well. But lots and lots of parishes, I'm sure this is true in your diocese too, lots and lots of parishes are struggling because they don't really understand this sacramental process, this sacramental vision. They're still thinking more like a scope and sequence program where they got to fill in all the catechetical topics, you know what they are. You've got a list. You probably have a list back home. They're 10 to 20 to 30. There's one parish in our diocese has 45 classes that the catechumens have to go to, and the topics are all listed on their website. So if you want to become Catholic in that parish, you go to the website and you'll see a sort of a high school theology program that you have to graduate from in order to become Catholic. That's what they think. That's what a new seeker will think the path is to become Catholic. This is the path. The path starts with evangelization. In evangelization, somebody told me once, for Catholics, evangelization is sitting by the phone waiting for it to ring. Where are the folks who need to be evangelized? They're not in church, right? They're not going to call you. They're going to see you out in the world somewhere. And they're going to say, man, how come you've got it together? And you're like, who are you talking to? But they see something Catholic in you. They see Jesus in you in some way out there. And then Pope Paul VI says that causes people to ask questions, which actually happened to you. People said, how come you've got it all together? And
Which is funny because I never thought I did.
yeah, you never thought you did. Right. But there's something, Jesus is coming out of you somehow. And that causes people to ask questions. And then what we got to do is say why. Why we believe, why we are like we are. That's evangelization. And when that person or another person gets curious about why you are like you are, and they want to have what you have, then we bring them into the first part of the sacrament, which is celebrating the rite of acceptance. And that is that's where they become Catholic. It's the RCIA says, at the rite of acceptance, then, they become members of the church, members of the household. Okay. But they're not done. They're like babies, right? So then during the catechumenate period, that's where we apprentice them in those 4 ways of being Christian, through word, community, worship, and service. And when they've kind of mastered that, then they're ready for initiation. Then they celebrate the rite of election. And again, how do you know when it's time to celebrate the rite of election? Because it's always the first Sunday of Lent, and it's when it's like how many of you learned to bake from your mother, your grandmother? When did Grandma sort of bless you that you knew how to make the pie? I'm still working on it, But it's not like you learned it different than your brothers and sisters did. You were the better cook, or your sister is the better cook, you know, and so maybe you're talented at music and you learn piano faster than your brother did, you know. So you're not done because you got to the end of the syllabus. You're done because you've mastered the way of doing things. And then that leads into this 90-day period of purification and enlightenment. We celebrate the rites of initiation, usually at the Easter Vigil, which then leads into a period of mystagogy and lifelong discipleship. Okay? All right. So that whole process, as we go through that process, which for some people could be several years, we have to always keep these principles in mind. We always have to go through that process based on these principles to train them in this way of living, the way that the early disciples did. All right, so let's look at each one of these principles kind of quickly. Bless you. First, paragraph 4 of the RCIA says that this is a gradual process. What's the word for gradual in Spanish? ¿Cómo se dice gradual en español? Gradual. Gradual? Oh, that's easy. Yeah. Because I'm not sure if it's true in Spanish. I think it's true in English. We forget what this means. What does gradual mean? Little by little. Poco a poco. Poquito a poco. Huh? Bit by bit, slowly. So. Now again, I told you, in my diocese, we have parishes who have the syllabus on their website. And if you go through all those classes, then you're done. At the end of the last class, you get to be Catholic. Now that's not gradual, right? Gradual is like how I learned to bake. I'd go to my grandma's house, and she'd throw a lot of flour around, and she'd let me, pretend that I was kneading the dough sometimes. And after many years of that, I finally became a passable baker. It's gradual. It's a gradual process. So when you encounter someone, when someone says, I want to know more about what you guys do, say, oh, that's a long story, But we're going to be here, so let's get started, And then it's going to take a while. Another, Father Gabe said this. He disappeared. Father Gabe said this, that this takes place within the community. It takes a community. Do you remember he said that? Mm-hmm. Paragraph 4 says, the initiation of catechumens takes place within the community of the faithful. Now, what does that mean? You've heard that, right? How many of you are frustrated that you can't get your community involved with RCIA? A couple of you. Some of you are doing it pretty well. Those of you who are doing it well, what are you doing? No. What it means is, if you go back to that New Testament image of the disciples there, what were they doing? You shouted out some of the things. What were they doing? Sharing, right? Okay, so if you take your seekers out to the places where your community is sharing, they're going to learn to share. What else was that New Testament community doing? Praying. So if you take your seekers out to where your community is praying, they're going to learn to pray. So how many of you have a rosary group in your parish? So you take your seekers to the rosary group. You say to the head of the rosary, what's the head of the rosary group's name? Somebody? Lenore. You call up Lenore. You say, Lenore, I got somebody. She got impressed. What's your name, dear? Natalie. She got impressed by Natalie. Natalie was walking around being Catholic in front of her, and this new person wanted to know more about Catholics. So can I send this seeker over to your rosary group next Tuesday, and will you kind of host her and be nice to her and show her what to do and all that? What's Lenore going to say? Is she going to say, no, because I don't want to be on your RCI team? No. She's going to say, yes, please send her. And then she'll introduce her to the group. And what's every rosary member going to do as soon as they hear there's a new person here that wants to learn about being Catholic? They're going to pray the rosary louder. They're going to sit up straighter. They're going to be more Catholic. So that's where the renewal starts to come in for our parishes. It's why do I pray the rosary? Why is this important to me? So getting the community involved doesn't mean getting more speakers to fill your 40 slots on Tuesday night. It means taking the seekers out to the community where your community is living the Christian life. We're going to take them out to the places where we are hearing the Word, where we're living the Word. We're going to take them to places where community life really happens in our parish. We're going to take them to places where we pray and worship. And we're going to take them with us when we witness to the world about our faith and when we serve the poor. That's what an apprenticeship model does. Okay? So the way to get the community involved is go through your bulletin, go through your parish calendar, and see what all the things are that your parish is doing. And start to involve your seekers in your parish. All right. The next principle is by joining the catechumens and reflecting on the value of the Paschal Mystery. How many of you know what the Paschal Mystery is? You don't want to raise your hands because you're afraid I'll ask you, right? Somebody tell me what the Paschal Mystery is. Passion, death, resurrection, Jesus Christ. Now we all know that, right? If when you met your seeker and she said, how come you've got it all together? And you said, because of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. What would she say? Yeah, she'd have been gone. Right. Now, this is a challenge because the whole sacramental process is rooted in the Paschal Mystery. So how can that be true if it's going to scare away the seekers? I think of this like an onion. We have to peel back the onion a little bit because we all in this room, we know what we mean when we say that. But what do we really mean? Like if you had to explain that to somebody who's new to us, how would you explain it? Redo your focus? What does that mean?
You have to learn how to focus on what's the priority.
Focus on the priority.
How are we getting through this life to get to the next?
Good. Wonderful. Sam?
I guess I would say it's salvation given to us by Christ.
Yeah.
That allows us to live Christ in the world.
Allows us to live Christ in the world. Excellent. What else might we do? Think of going even deeper. It's an onion, right? Pull back even deeper. How would you talk about Paschal Mystery? Yes.
Getting to know the person of Jesus in our life.
Getting to know the person of Jesus in our life, huh? Yeah.
What he went through during the
What he went through, yes. Yes.
I think I would also add in there the passing over into the new life.
Passing over into the new life, yeah. So did any of you ever pass over into the new life? You kind of had to be sitting here today, right? You know, I think we have to... I may run out of time at the end, but I'm going to tell this story. I tell this story to our catechumens when I have to explain Paschal Mystery to them. I don't start with all the stuff we've been talking about. I start with one day when I passed over into new life, and it wasn't one day. It was a couple of years. Because I was living in San Jose, and the pastor of my parish, he asked me if I would give a reflection on Holy Family Sunday at Mass, and I said no. Because my family's not holy. My family's a little broken. And especially at that time, my relationship with my brother was broken. We hadn't talked to each other then at that point for over 10 years, I think it was. And I'd always make sure, like when I went home to visit Mom, I'd make sure he wasn't going to be there or else I wouldn't go. You know? And so I didn't want to preach on Holy Family because my family wasn't holy. My pastor was not a nice guy. He said, you're going to do it anyway. All right, so then I'm nervous. And I'm in that church where that pastor was. So the ambo is kind of like here, the altar's over there, and it's one of the long churches, you know. And up high is stained glass all the way down. And right here, looking right over the ambo, this stained glass image here, what do you think it was? Holy Family. And you know what it looked like, right? Perfect family. Not my family. I didn't know what to say to him. I could point to that stained glass and I could say, that's what you're all supposed to do, but I wasn't doing it. So this is what I decided to do. I decided I would tell them about my family, the truth about my family, that I hadn't talked to my brother. And I would also tell them the truth that I didn't want to talk to my brother. And I wasn't going to talk to my brother. Here's what I promised I would do to the community. I said to them, this is what I promise. I promise that I will pray every day for God to make me want to talk to my brother. And so I did that for over a year. Prayed every day. And then I finally wanted, I'm not sure wanted is the right word. I had less resistance to calling my brother. So I called him. I had to call Mom first to get his number. Is that another thing? I called him, and he picked up the phone, and I said, Greg, this is Nick. And he hung up the phone. And then I felt relieved because I'd done my part, right? That's what the Holy Spirit did, laughed at me. I had to call back 4 times before he would not hang up. And it was slow and it was painful, and it took a long time. And I would call him about once a month for almost a year again, and we'd have these really difficult, awkward conversations, and I could tell he's just putting up with me. And then finally one day, my wife was in the room, and she heard me talking, and it was like the conversation was flowing, and it was easy. And I hung up, and she said, well, that sounded nice. I said, yeah, it kind of was. And, you know, somehow over all of that, finally our relationship was starting to heal. So, to me, that's Paschal mystery. It's like I was in a dark place. I was in a broken place. And through my friendship with Jesus, through my intimacy with Christ, and my promise to the Christian community that I would work on it. It was really, you know, not even my work so much. It was God's grace changing me, bringing me from my old life into a new life. And when we can start to tell our own Paschal mystery stories, then the catechumens, the candidates, they'll start to understand what we mean by being dead and being risen to life. We don't like to tell our Paschal mystery stories because usually we're not the heroes in those stories. You know? So that's our challenge, is how do we take that sort of churchy language and change it into real stuff for the catechumens and the candidates, huh? All right. Paschal mystery. Then the next principle is, by renewing their own conversion, the faith will provide an example. It took me a lot of years of reading this to really get it right. I thought for a long time this was about the conversion of the seekers. But read the sentence a little more closely. What does it say? Their own conversion. Right. So this, again, is where we have to be about I think as RCIA leaders, RCIA teams, we're not so much focused on the conversion of the catechumens. We're more about the conversion of the assembly, conversion of the parish, where we get them to focus on their own conversion. And we can do that by sending our seeker to Lenore's rosary group. You know, and ask Lenore to have everybody say a word about what they believe about the rosary, what they believe about Mary. And that will start to get them to focus on their own conversion. And by focusing on their own conversion, then providing an example to the seekers. The Rite offers several places where we find the prerequisites for conversion. So paragraph 42 are the signs of conversion that we're going to have to look for the seekers who want to become catechumens. Anybody know what it says in that paragraph? Anybody have your right with you? 42. Somebody got it? Shout it out. Just a couple things.
The first step is the beginnings of the spiritual life and the fundamentals of Christian teaching.
Okay, so beginnings, fundamentals. Somebody else shout out another thing. What else is in there?
Evidence of first faith.
Evidence of first faith. What else? Somebody else? What else? There's one in there about an intention to change their lives. and the first stirrings of repentance. So if you don't have your RCIA text with you, write down this paragraph number and go look it up when you get home and really kind of pray over it. Because what we're looking for in the seekers, we're not looking for the seekers to be changed. We're not looking for them to get it. We're not looking for repentance. We're looking for the first stirrings of repentance. It's like me saying to the community, I don't want to call my brother. I just promised to pray to want to. You know, the first stirrings. They don't have to have changed their lives in order to become catechumens. They can be the worst sinners in the world. They just have to have the intention to change their lives. They have to have the beginnings of a spiritual life. So the prerequisites here, it's a very low bar. Just like in the New Testament, right? What were Jesus' requirements for you to become part of the kingdom? Not much. You just had to kind of want to. And he had a lot of leeway for people that made mistakes. I love reading the stories about St. Peter. I mean, if he can make it, I can make it. All right. So it's during the catechumenate where we take those first stirrings of the faith and we start to practice the disciplines of the faith: word, community, worship, and service. And once they know how to bake the pie, once they get good enough in living as people of the Word, people in Christian community, people who pray and worship, and people who serve, then we can say that they're ready to celebrate the rite of election. So the prerequisites in paragraph 120 are, the paragraph is smaller, but the prerequisites are more stringent. We have to see evidence of conversion. So now it's not just they have to want to convert, but we have to see actual evidence of conversion. We have to see evidence that they're living a Christian life according to those 4 disciplines of word, community, worship, and service. When we start to see that evidence of change in their lives, then we can say that they're ready for initiation. Okay? All right, so it's based on conversion. It's an adult process. Social scientists have done great work in the last 10, 20, 30 years on understanding how adults learn. And we're using almost none of that research in the way that we form catechumens and candidates. Anybody here do any work with adult, like training in your work or college education or something like that? What's one principle of adult learning?
Critical thinking.
Critical thinking? Yeah. What else? Critical thinking? Yeah?
They've got to learn.
Yeah.
You're the sort of the guy up there in front, the learning has to take.
They have to be doing the work.
They have to be doing the work.
Yeah. What else? What's another principle? Yes?
They come to us with a lived experience.
Yeah, they come with a whole bunch of experience already. Right. What else? One that I really try to drill into new catechists is the person talking is the person learning. So if you're doing most of the talking, then you got to reverse that. Okay. Another thing is adults are goal driven. So every one of your seekers has some goal. It may not be fully articulated, but there's some goal in there, and I can almost guarantee it's not your goal. My goal is always to make them raving, passionate disciples of Jesus Christ who are going to go out and evangelize. None of them come with that goal. Right, so we got to find out what their goal is and start to shape the formation around helping them meet their goal. Okay. All right, so it's an adult process. We got to sort of move out of this sort of PowerPoint lecture style or worse is we go by the videos. And then we sit people down in front of the videos and we push play, and then Father so-and-so on the video is the one sort of, saying all the doctrines out loud. Somehow we think that's teaching. And I don't even think that's good for children. I don't know what that is. But we have to move out of that into more of a recognizing what people's lived experiences, knowing what their goals are, and listening to the promptings of the Holy Spirit to help move them along their journey of faith. And finally, the rite varies according to the many forms of God's grace, the free cooperation of the individuals, the action of the church, and the circumstances of time and place. Every single one of your seekers has to have a unique faith formation journey, will have a unique faith formation journey, and the formation process needs to be tailored to their journey. That sounds impossible, but I promise you it's not. If we get out of the scope and sequence syllabus-oriented style of learning and think more of an apprenticeship style learning, the Rosary Group may be great for your seeker, but the crop walk is going to be better for this seeker. You know? And your parish has a multitude of ways that your seekers can fit into what's going on. So their formation can be adapted to their individual journeys using your parish as the textbook, your parish as the curriculum. Okay? Questions about that, about those principles? Good? Okay. All right, then we're going to use, as I said, we're going to use these principles then to ground people in these 4 disciplines of faith: word, community, worship, and witness. All right, so real quickly, I want to move to our future according to Pope Francis. So this is where I see, if we could say what's going to happen with the RCIA in the next 10 years. If we take Pope Francis's exhortation seriously, I think it'll really transform the way we think about and work with the catechumenate process in our parishes. Pope Francis talks about the first proclamation, so we're going to look about why he does that, why that's important. We're going to talk about somebody said we can't get distracted, we got to focus. Pope Francis said the same thing. I don't know if the two of you were in conversation before he wrote that. We have to focus on Jesus. And then we're going to look at our job description as faith formation leaders and the 3 kinds of seekers we're going to encounter in the faith formation process. All right. Just before Pope Francis became Pope, just before Pope Benedict resigned, there was a synod of bishops in 2012. And at the synod, the bishops did not know that Benedict was going to resign. So they think they're gathering under Pope Benedict, and they're writing the results of their synod, their conversation. They're writing their document to hand on to Pope Benedict. So Pope Benedict never got it as Pope. It wound up going to Pope Francis instead. But this is what the bishops said. They came up with 10 proposals at that synod and I'm going to focus on the last 4 of them, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I translated this from the Latin, not an actual translation. I put it in English I could understand. First of all, they said we have to encourage all our parishes to evangelize. So again, this is a gathering of bishops from all over the world at the synod. And they said, going forward, Pope Benedict, they think they're talking to Pope Benedict, going forward, what we have to do is focus on getting all our parishes to evangelize. And we have to not ignore what's going on in the secular world. There are some, you've met a few Catholics that want to do this, where we just want to hide inside our church and ignore what's going on out there because it's too noisy and too messy. The bishop said we can't do that. Then they said the first proclamation is where the power is. We're going to talk about what that is. But they said that's where the power of the church resides, is in that first proclamation. And everyone has a right to know Jesus. All right, so Pope Francis, after he becomes Pope, he gets this document. This is his sort of marching orders from the bishops here. This is what the bishops say. Now, Pope Francis, because he's Pope, he can ignore it if he wants, but he didn't. He went, the document, Joy of the Gospel, incorporates every one of these. All right, so Pope Francis also, from his perspective, being in Latin America and also as a cardinal in the church, having a global view of the church, looks out at the world, not ignoring secularization, and sees what he perceives as a huge crisis, worse than ever. We've had a lot of crises in our world history, and Pope Francis says this is a time unlike any other. He said there's suffering on a scale we have never before experienced. In the church, he said, through the power of the Holy Spirit, can heal this great suffering. Does that sound like Francis to you? Yeah, right. He says he said this in lots and lots of ways. and lots of places. So he talks about the first proclamation. Have you heard Pope Francis talk about a field hospital church? What does he mean by that? Any military folks here? What's a field hospital? Triage.
Triage, or you take care of the immediate
You
need.
take care of the immediate need, right? So if you think of a battlefield, I've never been on a battlefield, but I imagine there are people there that, are going to die if they don't get attended to like right now. And there are other people who sprain their ankle running to hide. And they're, you need to help their ankle. But Pope Francis, he said, the people who are having a heart attack, you got to pay attention to them before you start talking to people whose cholesterol is a little high. So he's saying that we have to get our priorities straight. Pay attention to the folks that are in that crisis right now, that need on a scale like no other in the world. So he said the most important thing they need to hear, the folks who are suffering most in the world, he said the first thing they need to hear, the first proclamation, is that Jesus Christ has saved you. He calls that the first proclamation. Theologians call it the kerygma. You've heard that word, the kerygma? Okay, so what the Pope means by that is that core message of Jesus wants to draw you into his friendship. Jesus wants to have a relationship with this person, seeker over here, that he has with you. And everybody can see that we have this relationship, this thing that makes us not sourpusses. And the folks who are most in need, that's the message we need to tell them. The first proclamation is the fundamental message of Jesus. So the 42 topics on your syllabus, all of those are not the first proclamation, right? We have to get at the core, the first proclamation, the fundamental message of Jesus. Secondly then, the fundamental message of Jesus always causes healing. When I could promise to my community that I was going to at least try, I was going to pray to want to. I was going to pray to Jesus to give me that, draw me into that friendship enough that I would want to call my brother. And that's the healing process started. So in these stories, these core stories that the elect hear during their period of purification enlightenment are the Samaritan woman, the story of the man born blind, and the story of Lazarus. What does Jesus do in each of these stories? He's healing. So healing is part of the core fundamental message of Jesus. Pope Francis said, sometimes, I'm sure he was talking about somebody else's church, not our church, sometimes has locked itself up in small things, in small-minded rules. Anybody here ever experienced small-mindedness in your parish? If your pastor's sitting here, maybe you don't want to raise your hand. Or your staff, or parish committee, or in yourself, anybody, It's a human, the Pope knows this. The Pope himself, in the first interview after he became Pope, the interviewer said to him, well, tell the world, who are you? And what did he say? I'm a sinner. It's not the Pope is saying, I'm doing this well and you guys need to emulate me. He's saying we all fail at this, but we have to remind each other that we have to break out of this small-mindedness. He said we can't get distracted by all those little things, all the kind of the rules and the stuff and the minutia. He said we have to focus. We can't get diverted by many secondary superfluous things. That doesn't help. What helps is, he said, is to focus on the fundamental reality, which is the encounter with Christ. Always, when our seekers approach us, or when we go to Starbucks, or we go to work, or we're at our parent meetings at school, we have to always keep that focus. When people see me, are they having an encounter with Christ? Have I got a sourpuss, or am I smiling? On the lips of every catechist, the first proclamation must ring out over and over. Jesus Christ loves you. He gave his life to save you. And now he is living at your side every day to enlighten, strengthen, and free you. So if there's anything on that list of 42 things, or the way that we're presenting stuff, or the way that we're drawing seekers into friendship with Christ that does not do this, we have to stop doing it and refocus so the seekers are always getting this message. So we looked at the first proclamation, why Pope Francis thinks it's important to focus on that. So what does first mean? The Pope says, we can't think that in catechesis, the kerygma gives way to a supposedly more solid formation. Nothing is more solid or profound, secure, and meaningful than that wisdom-filled than that initial proclamation. All Christian formation consists of entering more deeply into the kerygma, which is reflected in and constantly illumines the work of catechesis. So there's no second proclamation. It's just always this fundamental core message of Jesus, thereby enabling us to understand more fully the significance of every subject which the latter treats. It is the message capable of responding to the desire for the infinite. Now here, I don't know if Pope Francis had someone else write that or if that's really him. It doesn't sound like him, but I think what he means here is the thing that your seeker saw in you is you live every day in this infinite. You know, you may not walk around talking like that, but we do, right? Like one of the things in the New Testament was they saw signs and wonders. How many people saw a sign and wonder today? Just Father Sam? I saw Father Sam, so that's a sign. You know, so we believe miracles happen. We go around talking like that. We go to people and say, "Oh, a miracle just happened. Let me tell you about the miracle that happened to me." And none of us are shocked to hear that from each other. And we live like that, and that desire for the infinite abides in every human heart. So the seekers who don't believe in God, who would tell you God does not exist, and they don't believe in miracles, in their human heart they have that desire for the infinite, and sometimes it gets translated into science or art or drugs or meaningless stuff. But everybody has that desire, and it's Christ who answers that desire. Yes, ma'am?
My son goes to go to Lehigh University, and he says, everybody in the university says that I believe in something great, some spiritual being, but they don't have this close relationship with God himself.
Yeah.
And then he goes, okay, the fact that you don't see God physical, that doesn't mean that he doesn't exist. Because I'm going to the lab, he said, and I don't see with my eyes the bacteria of all these bacteria until I go to the microscope and I see it too, and then it's there.
Yeah.
But because I don't see in the physical, that doesn't mean the bacteria doesn't exist. Because like the speech that I give to my
Good for him. All right. So I promise we're almost done here. The centrality of the kerygma calls for stressing those elements which are most needed today. So I want to give you these, and then we'll take a break. It has to express God's saving love. So everything we're doing in our catechesis has to express God's saving love. Everything we're doing should not impose the truth, but appeal to freedom. And everything we're doing should be marked by joy. We've already talked about that. Encouragement, liveliness, and a harmonious balance. So that's our job description. We have to be always expressing God's saving love. We have to be appealing to freedom, and we have to be joyful. That's your catechist job description. That's the job description of every RCIA team member. Sure. And again, you can get these slides at the end too. Okay. All right. So we're not going to go too deeply into three kinds of seekers because we're out of time. But basically, we have unbelievers, true seekers, and believers. The unbelievers are the ones who are out there. Yes. All right. So the three types of believers. Unbelievers are those who are out in the world, the ones who like meet your son and say, "I don't believe in stuff because I can't see it." And then true seekers, they wind up being our catechumens or our candidates. Those are folks who are learning the four disciplines of word, community, worship, and service. And believers, those of us who are all in need of constant renewal. Okay? So when we're looking at the catechumenate process, this evangelization period is always going on. There's, again, in my diocese, you can look on some parish calendars and they'll tell you the pre-catechumenate starts on September 12th and goes to October 3rd or something. Like that's when we could book the Holy Spirit in our parish. We're always reaching out to the unbelievers. And the seekers wind up in the catechumenate process, and the true believers wind up here in this throughout life, throughout the Sundays of the liturgical year. There's a parallel catechetical process, because I've had this happen where I've had a unbaptized person come and want to become Catholic, but they're already a believer. He's married to a Catholic, he's raising his kids Catholic, he knows how to talk about Jesus, he knows the Lord's Prayer. So he doesn't really fit, right? But he's still got to go through all these rites because he's unbaptized. But his catechetical process is going to be down here with ongoing catechesis. We don't need to give him primary proclamation like he's never heard the message before. It has to be a deeper expression of that primary proclamation geared to his level of faith. Then the reverse sometimes happens. We'll get a baptized Protestant who's married to a Catholic. And grew up in a liturgical tradition like Lutheran or Episcopalian. Because we have this thing called the RCIA, we think we have to put him through those 42 classes, and he could teach half of those classes. So again, we have to pay attention to where they are on the catechetical path as well as on the ritual path. Okay? So there are just to clarify, there are three kinds of seekers, and they're unbelievers. Now, we may have a baptized unbeliever. So the baptized unbeliever would not go through this ritual path. They're already down here on the ritual path. But they're up here in primary proclamation on the catechetical path. So you would not make a baptized unbeliever, you would not make them a catechumen. You can't go backwards. It's not really about what they believe, it's what God did. Right? God already made them part of the family. You can't undo that. And you can't pretend by putting them in the catechumenate. So, but they do need some kind of formation that's similar to the kind of formation a catechumen is going to get. Okay? All right. So, unbelievers, those indifferent to the faith. Pope Francis said, we got to live in a way that gives rise to questions, just like you did. Why do they live that way? What urges them on? The seekers, not yet true believers. We are going to look for those signs of conversion that are in paragraph 42 of the RCIA. So this is in your RCIA text. You don't need to write all these down. Just go to your RCIA text and underline all of them. They're all there. Okay. Once we see those signs of conversion, again, very minimal, low bar, then they get to enter into the catechumenate. And then we're going to form them in these 4 ways of Christian living. To hear and obey the word, to experience Jesus living beside us every day, how Christians express their joy, especially in worship, and extending Jesus' mission of mercy. So those are all in paragraph 75. It's not phrased exactly that way, but if you go through and read 75, you'll see the elements of all of that. Okay? And then believers in need of constant renewal. Okay, so this is our rosary group. We have to remind them about why they pray the rosary. We have to remind our lectors, why are you lectors? And that's the essence of what Pope Francis describes as new evangelization. So we're not so much, again, we're not having an adult faith formation night where we show a video to do new evangelization. We're asking the lectors, when you get up to read on Sunday, how much do you believe what you're saying? Let's get together and talk about that. So we start to do new evangelization by reminding people, calling them to what they've committed to in their lives. When you bring your child to get baptized, why do you want your child baptized? What do you believe? All right. So principles. The first proclamation is always charged. Something happens, something changes. If your catechumens aren't changing, then you're not doing first proclamation. Just think again of the gospel stories. When did Jesus ever have a conversation that the person he was talking to walked away the same as they were before he talked to them? So if they're having a true encounter with Christ, first proclamation, then they're changed. It carries meaning within meaning, revealing mystery. It's an encounter with Christ. It's a story of how Jesus saves us. It has a beginning, a climax, and an end. Okay, so when Pope Francis looks over the field and sees all those who are in great pain and darkness, he turns to us, turns to you, and he says, go heal the wounds. He said that to all of us. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to heal those wounds? We got to go out with confidence knowing we've got this great story, and it's that story, the story of how Jesus healed me when I was fighting with my brother. The story of how Jesus found the person I love more than anything in life, and we share life together. The story of how Jesus put me in a family with a mother who still prays the rosary for me every day today. The stories that are going to heal the world, those stories are healing stories. So that's where we've been today. When I was coming here to this, I'm thinking, Lord, there are people who know this better than me. I love you folks, but I didn't want to come. It's not because I don't like talking about this stuff, but I just feel inadequate to the task. And I'm sure you feel that way when a seeker comes to you and says, how come you've got it all together? And you're thinking, I don't have it together. We all fail from that. We don't think we're good enough. How many of you turned your pastor down when he said, will you be on the RCIA team? And he wouldn't let you. The Lord, this is Paul. Paul says, the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. Stop worrying so much. For power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. I can boast in my weaknesses, brothers and sisters. I can do that. And if you got a weakness or two and you can do that, then you and St. Paul, you're on the same track together. Okay? All right. Yes, ma'am.
I think what you're saying is that the more we know, and I know for myself, over the years and years and years that I've been in ministry in general, that the more you realize how much you do not know.
Yeah.
And it's gaining that insight into yourself and to the power that comes from the Holy Spirit, that constantly, today I'm learning so much.
Yeah.
Because I go for myself.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to conclude on. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. God bless you.